Today, on episode number 583 of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, I welcome back to the show James M. Lang to share about his latest book, Write Like You Teach, Taking Your Classroom Skills to a Bigger Audience.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonnie Stahoviak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to improve our productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. The warmest of welcomes to today's guest, James M. Lang. Jim is an author, educator, and speaker whose work has transformed how so many of us think about teaching, learning, and yes, writing. Jim is professor of practice at the Koenig Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Notre Dame and the author of 6 books, including Distracted, Small Teaching, and Cheating Lessons. In Write Like You Teach, Taking Your Classroom Skills to a Bigger Audience, Jim offers us a wonderful, authentic invitation to write the way we teach, rooted in curiosity, clarity, and care for our learners, otherwise known as our readers in this case. It's a guide not just to better writing, but also he includes a appendix that's a syllabus even for how to get our books published and get them out to wider audiences so that we can get what we have to share out to even more people. Jim Lang, welcome back to Teaching in Higher Ed.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here again.
I have felt for a while now that I must have missed the memo. And the memo is specifically, I don't know. I'd be so fascinated to know why I pretty much know practically nothing about Greek history, Greek mythology. Our kids are learning it in school and they got really into the Percy Jackson books and all that. So whenever I come across something that has something to do with Greek history, Greek mythology, I feel very intimidated. However, your book has started to get me on the road to healing, and it has to do with a book that's meant a lot to you. So tell us about Edith Hamilton's The Greek Way and what it might tell us about writing like we teach. And if you can just douse it a little bit with, Bonnie, you could actually read this book and like sell me on it, I guess is what I'm trying, not sell me on it, but give me self-efficacy that I seem to not have around the myth of mythology of Greek mythology.
Yeah, so I'll take Edith Hamilton was a classical scholar. Actually, she started her career as a teacher, and she was someone who grew up actually in the end of the 19th century, was given a sort of a classical education by her father, went to Germany to study classics. It was sort of there's a big connection between German scholarship and classical literature. And then she came home from Germany, and this was a time when it was sort of unusual for a woman to get her PhD and be able to become a college professor. And so she went instead and became a teacher at a girls' school, Bryn Mawr, in Maryland. And over the course of many years, she worked her way up to become the sort of, the principal of the school. She was a longtime teacher, but in her 50s, she actually retired from teaching in the school for various reasons, some health related. And then she started writing. And she had been interested in scholarship of classical literature for a long time. She started writing. And for around 10 years, she was doing that work. And then finally, in her early 60s, she published her first book, which was about an overview of Greek culture, ancient Greek culture, and what it contributes to our understanding of ourselves today, why it's important for us to think about the contributions that the Greeks made to this contemporary civilization. And strangely enough, this book became like a bestseller. It was like a National Book of the Month Club, and it's very well written. But still, it's like a nonfiction work for sort of like an educated reader. So it sort of tells you like how times were a little bit different in terms of the reading. The books that kind of shot to the top of the bestseller list. But anyways, I discovered this book like when I was sort of browsing around in a bookstore, like a used bookstore on Cape Cod. And I had, been interested in Greek history for most of my life. I actually took Greek language lessons when I was in high school and in college. I just was sort of always fascinated by that world. So I was just browsing around this bookstore. I spotted this book on the shelf. I took it down and brought it home and read it pretty quickly. And it was a great book. I was very drawn to the writing itself, but then I started looking at stuff about Edith Hamilton, the author, and discovered this sort of really interesting history that she had been a teacher for a long time, then retired as a teacher, and then found her way into being this really popular writer about ancient history. And she actually wrote multiple books actually about Greek history, Roman history, even history of the Hebrew Bible. So she became she had this sort of career transformation coming from becoming a teacher to becoming a great writer on these sort of like cultural topics. And I was fascinated by this possibility that this was a time in my own life when I've been teaching for a long time. I was sort of turning more and more toward writing and seeing how the strategies that she used to write her first book, I could really recognize these were the moves of a teacher. These were the things that a teacher would do to draw a reader in, to give them sort of like easy entry points to a difficult subject matter, tell good stories about the material, show how it's relevant to our lives. And so Edith Hamilton really started me on a journey to think about the things that we will learn as teachers, how they can sort of transform our lives by helping us become better writers and find new readers for the things that we write, the research, our ideas, the things we want to say to people.
The temptation in our teaching, the temptation in our writing is to think about what we have to say. And both in her work and also in so many of the other incredible writers that you share about in this book, you help us focus on the counterintuitive thing instead of what we want to say, what we want to ask. So tell us how questions can help us in our writing and in our teaching, of course.
Yeah, I think this is a big thing because I've been making the case for a long time that college courses should really have a driving question behind them. This notion that we can sort of walk into the room and say, okay, here, I've got this, I know a lot of stuff about this one subject matter, and now your job is sort of sit there and listen, and I'm going to share it all with you. And on the one hand, we know a lot of stuff, and the stuff is important, and we do want to share it. At the same time, that's not like a great way to sort of spark someone's curiosity. And learning often comes when people are curious. And so the way to sort of drive people into a subject matter, I think, is to find these deep questions that lead us to offer the answers that we have to offer. I like to always cite this work of Dan Willingham, where he talks about this notion that, answers on their own are not interesting. They become interesting when we know the questions behind them. And so I think, I've been making this case for college courses for a long time. And again, as I'm thinking about how we move from teaching to writing, it was sort of easy for me to think about this notion of, okay, what drives great books? What drives great nonfiction writing? Well, actually, also it becomes questions again. Questions are at the heart of a really good, successful nonfiction piece of writing, whether that's an essay or book. So what's the deep core question that we're trying to answer? We're trying to, share information, ideas, or advice with people. And so that might be like an immediate question, something about some issue which has sort of popped up recently. For example, like so many people so many of us are asking about AI right now, the impact that might have on the world. Like what are we gaining with AI? What are we losing from AI? So all those questions are sort of bubbling up now, and people are writing potential answers to those questions. And we can think about this though with anything that we write. So what are the fundamental, deep driving questions behind the answers that we have to share, and how we sort of surface those for the reader? So I think the challenge for us is oftentimes like those questions are somewhere back behind there. Like anything that we want to share with people, there's a question somewhere behind there because at some point we had a question about that subject matter. We sometimes lose track of those questions as we sort of become really fascinated by the answers themselves. And so I think one of the things that we have to do, both as teachers and writers, is sort of dig backwards and think about, okay, but what actually got me interested in the subject matter at first? How do I get back in touch with that and then really show the reader, hey, this is a really fascinating question I want to show to you. Now, let's talk about possible answers. And then that's the course or the piece of writing, the essays or book, whatever that might have been.
So many of the books that I read, I start out wanting to read them because I'm interested in these kinds of deep questions that they explore. I'm going to admit to you, Jim, that pretty much if you write a book, I'm already curious to want to read it before I even know what it's going to be about. And it was so fun for me reading it because I kept recognizing your writing strengths. And it was a joy then to also, with this one, get to see behind the curtain for some of these insights so I could better identify, oh, that's what it is that he does so well. And one of them is the role that being good company plays in nonfiction. So first, tell us, what do you mean by being good company? And what sources have you used to draw inspiration in your own writing and teaching and coming up with sort of your own definition of what it looks like to be good company?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is, when you take a reader on a journey, essentially like as the reader works through an essay or book that you've written, they spend a lot of time with you. They're spending a lot of time with that book. If you write a book that's 200, 300 pages long, the reader might be sitting with your words for 5, 10, 15, 20 hours, right? So that's a lot of time a reader is spending with you. And as the author of that book, you become like a persona that person sort of feels like they get to know a little bit about. And sort of the argument here is pretty simple. Be good company for that person, right? If you take a journey with someone, like you take a road trip with someone, or spend a day with someone out on a hike or something like that, you want to be with a good person who is good company, who has interesting things to say, maybe will teach you a thing or two, but that also tells good stories, has a little bit of a sense of humor about them. And so having this notion of being attentive to the person that you are on the page, to the reader, so they feel like they're spending time with someone who is a pleasant person to be around, that has good capacity to tell stories and make a joke here and there, be willing to reveal something about themselves occasionally here and there. That's all I really mean by being good company. But I think it makes a difference. And if we actually think about, again, going back to teaching, when I think about my own undergraduate professors that I really remember that made an impact on me, they were not just sort of like these abstract peoples on stages trying to give me lectures about things that were important to them. They sort of revealed themselves to me a little bit. They were willing to sort of share things that were going on in their family occasionally here and there, not like oversharing, but just sort of showing me that they were real humans. They were dealing with sort of life stuff along the way over the course of the 15-week semester, and also showing me their passion. Like they really cared about these things. They cared about the things they were talking about, how they got into the discipline, what their journeys were like, and as students themselves. So, like just being able to show me a little bit like who they were, that was inspiring to me to see like, oh yeah, I could become something like this, right? And so the thing that I want to sort of share with authors is be good company like that. Think about your role as a teacher, and oftentimes in the classroom, we sort of do this sort of naturally. Then we shift over to our writing. We're like, oh no, I'm going to be like this abstract expert, just sort of putting my ideas onto the page. Well, we can still be good company for a reader in the same way we can be good company for students in our courses. I was sort of inspired by this, some great nonfiction writers, and I think immediately of Susan Orlean and her book, The Orchid Thief, and just think about this notion of, she wrote this great book about the passions and the obsession we have, about how do we develop passions in our lives and how those passions can drive us and both give us purpose, but also sort of unravel us. And she did that by sort of showing herself a little bit as she's, sought to track down this story. So I think about her as a great writer, in this respect. A lot of other folks in terms of like who wrote great nonfiction works, but also were willing to sort of give the reader a glimpse into who they were and what drove them into the writing or to the subject matter themselves.
One of the most surprising discoveries that I had in reading Write Like You Teach had to do with AI. And because I wasn't expecting it from you, Jim. And you include AI tools as optional companions as we're working through our writing. And I'm so curious, what was either one of the most helpful or surprising ways that you have now come to see as generative AI possibly being a support in the writing process?
Well, I should sort of first acknowledge that a lot of things I think should not be, sort of offloaded to AI for writers who want to kind of become more, I guess, expand their audiences, expand their readerships. I think it's really important for us to sort of still lean into the things that I think produce great writing. And so even the idea generation, drafting of prose, even the sort of core work or revision, I think those things are really important for us to still do as writers. At the same time, I think the research part of it can be really, AI can be very useful for that. I use it myself to sometimes to think about expanding the sort of the place I might go initially for doing research on potential titles or that I might look at subject matter that might go push me beyond where I even might think to go. For example, like expanding the diversity of the sources I would use. That's been a helpful thing for me. I think sometimes it can be helpful also for like, basic level editing. Give me a sense also like, giving me like a reader's perspective on something that I've written and then give me some perspective like, oh yeah, a reader might be confused about this or that. I don't want the AI to then give me new phrasing. I want to do that work myself, but it's helpful for sometimes for me to see, oh, someone might be confused about this, or this is a phrase that might not land very well with a reader who doesn't know much on your subject matter. So those are things I think can be useful, and they could be, in the same way in like education. There's potential useful tools, useful ways in which AI can support learning. I think the same is true on writing, but ultimately at our core, I think that both as teachers and writers, I think it's really important for us to still do that work human to human and coming from our own brains.
One of the things that didn't necessarily surprise me as much, but it's been fun to know you now for more than a decade and watch your own, I guess, expansion or transformation in terms of this whole idea of building a platform as part of a writer's work. What would be some of your suggestions if you were to put on your small teaching, or in this case, small building a platform ideas that educators might want to try if this is somewhat of a new thing to them without getting overwhelmed with the whole idea of trying to build a platform?
And the first principle I would say is start right now. That's
Mm,
the most important thing, right? This can be very intimidating when you go out to a publisher, and if you have a great book idea or a great essay idea and you go to an editor, the first thing they're going to sort of note is, where are you? Like, where are you appearing already? Like, are you largely in academic journals? Do you have a social media presence? Do you have like some kind of like a Substack or like some kind of regular way to sort of share your ideas with other people? I mean, you might maybe have a podcast. Whatever you have, that's the first thing. They're going to sort of look for that first. And so I would say, don't, because this notion is having a platform is really important for publishers to see that an author has a potential platform they could build upon to help them reach more of an audience with the essay or the book they might write. And so you can think about, well, platform that, well, that's like a big undertaking. That's for sort of folks who have a lot of resources to put into, I don't know, building like a website, all that kind of stuff. And potentially you might want to get there in the future. But I would say initially, just start somewhere. Create a social media account. Start posting occasionally in your subject area. Or even like, it's not that difficult to put together a very simple, basic website and start putting blog posts there, sharing your ideas. But I think there's two things about building a platform. One is it helps eventually get your name in front of other people. And so you start becoming part of a community of people who work on this stuff out beyond your normal disciplinary colleagues. That's part of it. But the other thing is the more that you do it, it helps you think about conceptualizing your ideas for different audiences. So the way I might share an idea in a full book is different from how I would do it in a social media post and also in a Substack column or in a Chronicle column. So all these different ways of putting the same idea out, as I'm doing these different things in different formats, my ideas are actually developing. So I think this is not just something we just do to sort of, this sort of crass way to get readers. Actually, it's a quite helpful thing for me to do to help me putting my ideas in different frameworks, pitching them to different audiences. And as I do that, they evolve, they get better. So sometimes the difficult thing about writing books is, I wrote this book, the idea's out there now, and I could just sort of say, okay, this idea, I just want to keep repeating it. But actually, as I move forward with sort of my platform activity, for example, like writing essays or social media posts or giving talks about it, those ideas continue to grow and evolve, which is great, right? So the book itself, like if you publish a book and it gets a readership, something I've noticed is the book itself becomes one plank in a platform. But the other stuff that you surround it with, the social media stuff, the talks, the lectures, whatever you might do, those things help your platform grow, but they also help your ideas grow. And oftentimes, some of you might do like following the publication of a book, for example, like writing a follow-up essay, might lead you to the next thing. And so I think it's worthwhile just starting somewhere in activity, and you'll get more and more comfortable with it, and it may help you evolve as a writer and a thinker.
One thing that you didn't mention in your advice is, or I think it may be helpful for us to share with listeners. And I want to circle back to, you were talking about students wanting to see us as human beings. And that can really actually be more of a challenge than sometimes I am able to recall. Like, wait a second, you're not going to just come across as approachable just because you think of yourself as approachable. And so I've told students before, that other professors, these are real human beings. And what are things that you might do to help them? Because a lot of times students don't realize that they could actually be helpful to professors. So I'll talk to them, even, if you took 5 minutes to write a little thank you note, or maybe LinkedIn, you write them a recommendation instead of asking them to write you one, et cetera, et cetera. And I was thinking about the people that maybe if they're wanting to start small and it seems too overwhelming to start to create your own content, perhaps even just commenting or engaging with other people's platforms online. Do you have any further guidance to think about if I don't feel confident enough or don't feel like I have the time to start my own platform, how I might be inadvertently building a platform by supporting other people's work?
Absolutely. And I think, whatever you choose to do with a platform, one of the best things you can do is just sort of acknowledge the things that have been inspiring to you. So, for example, if you're in social media, reposting things, sharing links to books, new resources or ideas. In my own Substack column, which I use actually to write about works of literature that have inspired me, or works of literature or philosophy that have inspired me as a thinker, as a scholar, as a teacher and a writer. Essentially, that's what I'm trying to do, is sort of share the things that have inspired me and hope that they're going to inspire other people as well. So thinking about how we got to where we are, both as scholars, as professionals, as thinkers, writers, teachers, that's the easy way to start. Just sort of sharing our own journeys or the things that have been important to us, and hope they sort of other people might find the same kind of inspiration that we found in those places as well. So it's not that difficult to sort of just take that sort of stance, right? So my work here in a social media account, or in a blog post, or even like a piece of writing for like a more popular audience, those places are essentially to sort of surface the work of great people that you admire, or surface the work of more diverse scholars or diverse folks who are trying to get their names out. Well, we can help support those folks and get their names out in front of other people. And it also then helps us, again, get the habit of putting ourselves out in front of people in a more general way that can lead and support that kind of platform building that we're trying to accomplish.
I think one other bit of advice we could invite you to share, Jim, has to do with your own work in editing a book series. So instead of thinking about it as individuals, what have you learned by doing this process collectively with other authors, getting the word out and reaching that broader audience as a collection of authors and thinkers and scholars?
Yeah, I think one thing I've noticed definitely in the authors in the book series I co-edit with Michelle Miller at the University of Oklahoma Press, how much they've leaned into the community of the authors that we have already. And so I see that every time, someone else, we have an author is sort of welcomed into a group of people that we have published, they sort of really start connecting by promoting the work of other books in the series. And I think one of the most recent books that we published, The Opposite of Cheating by Tricia Bertram Gallant and Dave Redinger, they really lean into this. They started a little podcast based on the book, but they've been interviewing people. And also, I've seen how they've sort of shouted out other books in the series. And this is a good idea, because in the area that the books are published in, teaching and learning and higher education, no, it's a small community, but it's a vibrant community. And so I think that they're sort of both, not only they're being welcomed in, but then trying to sort of support the other folks that they see in the group. And I also see how they're sort of learning from each other, right? Like, okay, I see like they might reach out to me or someone else in the group and will say, hey, how do you get started as a speaker, or like giving workshops on other campuses? Or some of them will ask me, like, how do you start writing for the Chronicle or for Inside Higher Ed? And so they're kind of reaching out to each other to help support each other. And likewise, this is, whatever area you might be publishing in, this is a good idea, right? So reach out to people and think about, ask them to think about how you could move forward in terms of getting your name out there, building a platform, making connections with editors. And I will say, when I look back at my own career, like many times people did this for me. Sometimes people reach out to me like without me asking, but other times I went to people and said, listen, I see your work here or there. I would love to do that kind of work. Do you have any advice for me? And most of the time, people were very generous to me. When I look back at my own writing career, like many people hands lifted me up. And so I want to be able to do that same thing. And I've seen the authors in our series do the same thing with the new authors. And as the new authors come in, I see them doing as, even bringing new authors into us over the course of the time we've been doing this book series.
One of the final things for us to explore before we get to the recommendations segment has to do with revision, something that so many of us writers struggle with. What's one revision strategy in your own practice that's really been transformative for you?
So I would say two things about revision I think are worth always noting. The first is you have to be willing to let go of anything. So like I'm actually I've been working on a Chronicle column for the last 2 days. And, when I look at all the words I've drafted in that column, it ends up being like a 1,500 word column. I probably drafted 3,000 words for that. And that's just so common for me. But it's hard to let things go. You put something on the page, you're like, okay, this is good. I wrote it. It's there. I want to find some way to work with it. And I've become such a friend of the delete button or the backspace button to just say, okay, you know what? Or the cut button. And sometimes I'll cut it. I'll cut it because I'm like, okay, but wait, I might use it later, but I never use it again.
Mm-hmm.
So that this is like a little fiction I'll tell to myself, just cut it for now and just, but then I actually don't put it anywhere. So like, it definitely is gone. But you have to be willing, first of all, to acknowledge that you're going to write a lot of stuff and you have to be willing to let a lot of it go. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing is be willing to sort of move things around. And we can do that in different ways. There's a sort of analog way. I know, Christine Tully, who has a podcast on writing and talks about this notion of, printing out an essay, for example, and then literally cutting it up and moving things around. Like the opening section, well, maybe that could be the closing section. And actually, making a space for desk and moving parts of the essay around. You can do the same thing, of course, digitally. And just having a clipboard or moving things around a document and just be like moving sections around. There's other actually things you can do like Scrivener or Quill that have these same tools in them. But the notion here is that the bits of your piece, you can think about them as like this sort of linear unfolding of an idea when you first draft it. But then you can also think about like more of a mosaic, right? And the different parts might be put in different orders to produce a different kind of effect. Or have maybe that's the best way to draw a reader in is the great story you have in the middle of the essay. You want to put that in the beginning, and then the thesis comes a little bit later. So I think those two things are really important thinking about as we revise. Be willing to let things go. Don't get tied to any particular phrase, sentence, or even paragraph. And secondly, be willing to move things around, because that moving around process not only might produce a better essay, but also, again, it might spur creative thinking. As you move things around, you see a new connection, a new way to think about this, a new pathway for the next thing that might come. So those are the two things for me that have been most important.
Well, this is the time in the show where we each get to share our recommendations. And if it isn't obvious, please, yes, of course, go pick up a copy of Write Like You Teach, another incredible book by James Lang. And I also wanted to recommend a book that I privately recommended to Jim. It was so fun after, getting back inside your writing voice, Jim, and seeing all these behind the scenes. I kept thinking of you while I was listening to this particular book. And in this case, it's called The Siren's Call: How Attention Became the World's Most Endangered Resource by Chris Hayes. And I really enjoyed it because Chris does so many of the things that Jim talks about in terms of being a good writer. He shows up as a human being. He talks about his own flaws as a human, desiring attention from others, and the ways in which fame can definitely mess us up. Various kinds of fame. You might be famous in a particular context. You're not going to be recognized walking down the street. He talks about that. But in his case, he went from being a person who was unrecognizable to someone who did. And he talks about it as a journalist, how that can be a difficult thing to navigate. He talks about it as a human being, as a parent, as someone who wants to learn things and pay attention to the important things in life. And just this real reckoning with how attention has become so commodified and bought and sold, and how that is really hurting the fabric of our society. It's a great read, and I thought it would couple so nicely with the book that I've already recommended many times from Jim Lang about our attention as well, but specifically in a teaching context, called Distracted. So if you've not picked up Distracted, you definitely got to go pick that up. But it was fun, Jim, just to send you a quick email and say, I've read your stuff about attention. I know you're paying attention to attention, and this was just a wonderful read. And again, I read it as an audiobook. It is read by Chris Hayes himself, and it was quite an enjoyable read. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Jim, for whatever you'd like to recommend.
All right. So actually, I bought that book after you recommended it to me. I haven't started it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah. So of course, I wrote a book about writing, and now I have to follow that up with a book about reading.
Mm-hmm.
And so my next book I'm working on is about reading and how reading has changed over time, and what that means for us as teachers. And because of that research for that book, which I've just started to do, I'm going to recommend a great book by Marianne Wolf, a neuropsychologist at Tufts University, who's written multiple books about reading. And the sort of, the first book that really caught the attention of the world for her was Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain. It's a fantastic book. And, it actually exemplifies one of the things I read about in Write Like You Teach, because she takes this idea of, what happens when we read. And you might think about this person coming from neuropsychology, really focused on the brain stuff. And there's a lot of that. But she also pairs that with this notion of what reading does for us culturally, and like, what was the history of reading? Who were the first people to read, and the invention of writing and reading. And in the book, in Write Like You Teach, I mentioned this notion that we sometimes have to step beyond sort of the areas that we're most comfortable with, like the traditions of evidence or data, and sort of expand our view of potential ways we might write about a subject matter. And Marianne Wolf does a great job of that, pairing science with history, the culture. And ultimately, she also writes about her own son who has dyslexia. And she talks about actually what goes wrong in the reading brain, and sort of pairing that personal story with these other sort of perspectives as well. So it's a fantastic book. So it's actually a more important book than it was. It is more important now than it was even when it came out, 10 or 15 years ago, as we think about the importance of reading and what drives reading, and why reading is so important to us, both individually and also as a culture.
Thank you so much for that recommendation, and for what has been more than a decade of you coming and investing your time in the teaching and higher ed community. What a joy it was to read this book, to know you, and to get to continue to learn from you, and get to spread this out to so many of the listeners all these years.
10 years. It's been a long time, Bonnie.
That's been a long time.
I guess I have to keep writing more books to make sure that I keep coming back here as much as possible.
Thank you so much for today.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks once again to James Lang for joining me on today's episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. Today's episode was produced by me, Bonnie Stachowiak. It was edited by the ever-talented Andrew Kroger. Podcast production support was provided by the amazing Sierra Priest. If you've yet to sign up for the weekly emails from Teaching in Higher Ed, you can get the most recent episode's show notes and not have to remember to go look everything up, but you can have it all consolidated in one place, as well as some other resources that don't show up in those show notes. So head over to teachinginhighered.com/subscribe to start getting the weekly update. I'll see you next time on Teaching in Higher Ed.